In the quiet suburban town of Maplewood, Connecticut, the Ramsey family embodied the picture of success. At the helm was Richard Ramsey, a 45-year-old investment banker whose tailored suits and polished demeanor made him a pillar of the community. His sharp intellect and unrelenting work ethic had built a career that supported their stately colonial home, complete with manicured lawns and the pristine image of a perfect family. But perfection, as the residents of Maplewood knew too well, was often a thin veneer. Beneath the glossy surface of the Ramsey household lay fractures that no amount of money or charm could repair. Melanie Ramsey, Richard's second wife, was a striking woman of 38. With her dark hair and impeccable fashion sense, she was the kind of woman who drew admiring stares at charity galas and PTA meetings alike. Melanie had carved out a name for herself as a talented interior designer, her clientele including some of the most influential figures in the community. But to Melanie, her career was more than just a livelihood, it was an escape. Growing up in the foster care system of Hartford, she had longed for stability and belonging. Marrying Richard had seemed like the culmination of that dream, but the reality had turned out far messier. Then there was Noah Ramsey, Richard's 20-year-old son from his first marriage. Noah was everything the pristine Ramsey image was not: rebellious, volatile, and painfully aware of his place as the family's afterthought. His childhood had been shaped by the bitter divorce between Richard and his mother, Hannah Dawson, an artist who had traded the structured world of Connecticut for the bohemian beaches of California. When Hannah left, Noah stayed behind, caught between the cold expectations of his father and the distant warmth of sporadic phone calls from his mother. For Melanie, Noah was a puzzle she had never managed to solve. Despite her attempts to bond with him over the years, she was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. To Noah, Melanie was an interloper, an opportunist who had taken his mother's place and pretended to care. The house, grand as it was, never felt like home to him. It was merely a battleground where he and Melanie waged silent wars, while Richard buried himself in his work to avoid the fallout. Outwardly, the Ramseys lived a life most would envy. Their home on Maple Street was the envy of their neighbors, their names regular fixtures in the local society pages. But the truth was far less glamorous. Richard's long hours left him blind to the tension simmering in his family. Melanie, while maintaining the perfect hostess smile, was privately unraveling under the strain of balancing her growing business with the cracks in her marriage. And Noah, stuck in the shadows of his father's success and the glare of his stepmother's resentment, was quietly nurturing a storm of his own. Maplewood prided itself on being a community of low crime and high standards, where families like the Ramseys were its crown jewels. But behind closed doors, the perfect facade was beginning to crack. And no one, not Richard, not Melanie, not even Noah, was prepared for the chaos that would ensue when those cracks became impossible to ignore. In the Ramsey household, appearances were everything. But appearances could only last so long before the truth demanded to be seen. The heat of summer bore down on Maplewood in July 2023, and the Ramsey house stood still under the weight of its carefully curated silence. Inside, Noah Ramsey was nursing the remnants of a hangover, his head pounding from the night before. The garage where he worked had closed early for the day, leaving him with little to do but return home, a place he usually avoided unless absolutely necessary. As he trudged through the grand foyer, his eyes fell on the medicine cabinet in the master bedroom. Melanie and Richard were out, the house blissfully empty. He ventured upstairs, passing the gallery wall of family photos that always made him feel like an outsider. Reaching his father and stepmother's pristine bedroom, Noah's search for aspirin led him to the bathroom. The pill bottle was tucked behind a row of expensive skincare products, a testament to Melanie's meticulous nature. He popped the cap, swallowing 2 tablets dry, when a faint buzzing sound drew his attention. It was coming from the nightstand. Curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled him to investigate. Melanie's phone was sitting there, vibrating softly. The screen lit up with a text notification. "Can't wait to see you tonight, my love. E." Noah froze. The casual intimacy of the message was unmistakable. He picked up the phone, the pounding in his head momentarily forgotten. His thumb hovered over the screen as another text appeared. Don't forget, 8 p.m. at the usual spot. Miss you already. The sender's name, Ethan Kingsley, triggered a faint recognition. Melanie had mentioned the name before, during one of her overly cheerful dinner conversations. He was one of her clients, a wealthy property developer she had been working with on a series of high-end renovations. But this was far beyond business. Noah's lips curled into a cynical smirk as realization set in. His perfect, polished stepmother had secrets of her own. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hangover forgotten, scrolling through the message thread with a mix of morbid curiosity and malicious delight. The texts were explicit, brimming with passion and promises of a future together. There were references to rendezvous at motels and whispered exchanges during Richard's business trips. The more Noah read, the deeper his smirk grew. For years, he had felt powerless, a shadow in the Ramsey household. But this was ammunition. For the first time in a long while, Noah felt like he had the upper hand. That evening, Melanie returned home in high spirits, her day spent discussing color palettes and furniture arrangements with a high-profile client. She walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, only to find Noah leaning against the counter with an unsettling grin. "Hey, Mel," he drawled, the casual nickname dripping with mockery. She paused, setting her handbag down. "Noah," she replied cautiously. "You're home early." "Yeah, slow day at the garage," he said, picking up a grape from the fruit bowl and popping it into his mouth. "You, have a good day?" There was something off in his tone, and Melanie's instincts prickled. She studied him, trying to gauge his mood, but the smirk on his face was unreadable. "It was fine," she said, brushing past him toward the fridge. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," he replied, his voice light. "Just wondered if you happened to see Ethan Kingsley today." The sound of the fridge door swinging shut was deafening in the sudden silence. Melanie turned to face him, her face a careful mask of composure. "What are you talking about?" Noah shrugged, feigning innocence. "You know, Ethan Kingsley. I remember you mentioning him before. He's one of your clients, right?" Her grip on the countertop tightened imperceptibly. "Yes, he is." "Why?" "Well," Noah said, stepping closer, "it's just interesting. You guys seem pretty close, judging by the texts on your phone." The color drained from Melanie's face. "You went through my phone?" she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "Relax, Mel. It was just sitting there, buzzing away." "Hard not to notice," Noah said, his tone laced with false nonchalance. "Gotta say, though, I didn't expect my dear stepmom to be the star of her own soap opera." Melanie's carefully constructed world teetered on the brink of collapse as Noah laid out everything he knew. Her denials were weak and fleeting, crumbling under the weight of his evidence. When he mentioned the possibility of telling Richard, her voice cracked with desperation. "Noah, please," she pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," he said, leaning in close. "And here's how it's going to go, you're going to pay me $1,000 a month. In cash. And in return, I won't say a word to Dad." Melanie's breath hitched. "You can't be serious. Do I look like I'm joking?" Noah's smirk hardened into a sneer. "You want to keep this little fantasy life of yours intact? Then you'll pay up." The kitchen felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Melanie's mind raced, weighing her options, but Noah left her none. After a long, agonizing silence, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine," she said. "You'll get your money." Noah straightened, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. As he left the kitchen, Melanie stood frozen, the weight of her predicament pressing down on her. She had no idea that this was just the beginning of a nightmare far worse than she could imagine. By October 2023, the fragile equilibrium in the Ramsey household was unraveling at an alarming pace. The tension that had quietly simmered for years had now reached a boiling point, and Noah Ramsey was at the center of it all. His newfound power over Melanie was intoxicating. The $1,000 monthly payment had become a source of smug satisfaction for him, a constant reminder that he controlled her fate. But Noah was not content to stop there. It was a cool autumn evening when Noah made his next move. Richard was away on another business trip, leaving the house quieter than usual. Melanie had retreated to her office, poring over design proposals in an attempt to distract herself from the ever-present shadow of Noah's demands. She had just finished replying to a client email when the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A moment later, Noah appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with that same infuriating smirk. "We need to talk," he said, his tone light but laced with an undercurrent of menace. Melanie stiffened. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice weary. Noah stepped inside, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I've been thinking. $1,000 a month? It's not really cutting it anymore. Inflation, you know. Costs are going up." Melanie set her laptop aside, her eyes narrowing. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm dead serious," Noah replied, his smirk widening. "Let's call it $1,500. Starting next month." The blood drained from Melanie's face. "That's absurd. Where do you think I'm going to get that kind of money? Your father isn't blind, Noah. He'll notice if I start withdrawing that much." Noah shrugged, his expression unbothered. "That sounds like your problem, not mine. You've got a good thing going here, Mel. A fancy house, a successful husband, a thriving career. Would be a shame if it all came crashing down because Dad found out about your little extracurricular activities." His words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, Melanie felt the urge to lash out. But she held herself back, knowing it would only make things worse. "You're pushing too far," she said, her voice trembling. "This can't go on." "Oh, it can," Noah said, leaning closer. "And it will." Desperate and running out of options, Melanie did the only thing she could think of. She turned to Ethan Kingsley. They met at their usual spot, a rundown motel on the outskirts of Maplewood. The room, dimly lit and heavy with the scent of stale air freshener, was a far cry from the glamorous settings Melanie usually frequented. Ethan sat across from her, his sharp suit contrasting with the dingy surroundings. He listened intently as Melanie poured out the whole sordid story, her voice trembling with every word. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to help me," she said, her voice breaking. "He's going to ruin everything." Ethan's expression darkened. For a moment, he said nothing, the weight of her words settling over him. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "So, the kid thinks he's untouchable," Ethan said finally, his tone cold. "We'll see about that. What are you going to do?" Melanie asked, her voice laced with both hope and fear. "I'll handle it," Ethan replied. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but his eyes betrayed something far more dangerous. "Just leave it to me." A week later, Ethan made his move. He waited until late evening, when Noah was wrapping up his shift at the garage. The parking lot was nearly empty, the only sounds the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional car passing by. Ethan leaned against the hood of his sleek black sedan, watching as Noah stepped out of the building. "Noah Ramsey," Ethan called, his voice cutting through the night. Noah turned, his brows furrowing as he took in the sight of Ethan. The older man's sharp suit and confident stance exuded authority, but Noah was not easily intimidated. He approached slowly, his posture tense. "Who the hell are you?" Noah asked. Ethan smirked. Let's just say I'm someone who knows what you've been up to. Noah's eyes narrowed. Oh, let me guess. Melanie sent you. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. Listen carefully, kid. Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now. You back off, you stop harassing Melanie, and you walk away. Do that, and we won't have a problem. Noah crossed his arms, a defiant grin spreading across his face. And if I don't? Ethan's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it. For a moment, the two men stood in tense silence, the weight of the threat hanging in the air. Then Noah laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed in the empty lot. You think you can scare me? He sneered. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm not going anywhere, and Melanie's going to keep paying. Unless, of course, you'd like me to have a nice little chat with Richard. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped back, his voice calm but icy. Suit yourself, kid. But don't say I didn't warn you. As Ethan walked back to his car, Noah watched him go, his smirk still firmly in place. But as the taillights disappeared into the night, a flicker of unease settled in his chest. For the first time, he wondered if he might have underestimated his opponent. And for the first time, Ethan felt the dark, familiar pull of the methods he had long sworn to leave behind. The tension in the Ramsey household had reached an unbearable peak by late December 2023. Melanie could feel it in the cold, strained silences at the dinner table, in the way Richard's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, as if sensing something amiss. Noah, emboldened by months of holding her secret hostage, had become openly defiant. His smirks were sharper, his comments more cutting, and his demands increasingly brazen. For Melanie, the walls were closing in. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, blanketing the quiet outskirts of Maplewood. The old mill, a decaying remnant of the town's industrial past, stood as a lonely silhouette against the gray sky. This was where Ethan Kingsley had arranged to meet Noah, under the guise of a business opportunity. Noah arrived late, his beaten-up sedan skidding slightly on the icy gravel. He stepped out, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, his expression one of wary curiosity. Ethan was already waiting, leaning casually against his black sedan, his polished shoes leaving no prints in the snow. Nice place for a chat, Noah said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a thick envelope. He extended it toward Noah. What's this? Noah asked, his brows knitting together. 50 grand, Ethan said evenly. Take it. Walk away. Don't come back. For a moment, Noah simply stared at the envelope. Then he laughed, the sound echoing in the still air. 50 grand? You think I'm that cheap? Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. It's more than fair. Take the money, leave town, and let this go. Noah's grin turned cruel. Here's the thing, Ethan. I've got a better offer. How about you make it $250,000? And while you're at it, maybe I'll let Richard know about you and Melanie. Think he'd enjoy hearing the details? Ethan's hand curled into a fist at his side, but his voice remained dangerously calm. Careful, kid. You're playing a game you don't understand. Oh, I understand just fine, Noah shot back, stepping closer. You're desperate to protect her, and I'm the one holding the cards. So here's how this is going to work. He didn't get to finish. With a speed that caught Noah off guard, Ethan closed the distance between them. His fist connected with Noah's jaw, sending the younger man stumbling backward into the snow. For a moment, Noah lay there, stunned. Then he scrambled to his feet, his expression shifting from shock to fury. You think you can scare me? Noah snarled, charging at Ethan. The ensuing struggle was brutal. Noah, younger and stronger, had the advantage of sheer energy, but Ethan's precision and experience quickly turned the tide. Blow after calculated blow left Noah reeling, until he collapsed against the icy ground, blood dripping from his split lip. Ethan loomed over him, his breath visible in the freezing air. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Walk away, or next time, I won't stop." For the first time, fear flickered in Noah's eyes. But it was fleeting. As Ethan turned and walked back to his car, Noah sat up slowly, wiping the blood from his mouth. His body ached, but his anger burned hotter than ever. The annual Christmas Eve party at the Ramsey home was in full swing. The house was a picture of festive perfection, adorned with garlands, twinkling lights, and the rich scent of spiced cider. Guests mingled in the living room, their laughter and the clink of glasses filling the air. Melanie, dressed in an elegant crimson gown, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She felt Noah's presence before she saw him, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing against her chest. Turning, she spotted him by the bar, nursing a whiskey, his dark eyes fixed on her with a predatory intensity. As the evening wore on, Noah made his move. Catching her alone near the dining room, he leaned in close, his voice low but cutting. $5,000, he whispered. By the end of the week. Melanie stiffened, her heart pounding. You're out of your mind. No, Melanie, he said, his smirk returning. You are, if you think this ends any other way. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. Not here, she hissed. We'll talk later. Oh, we'll talk, Noah said, stepping back with a mocking grin. But you better have your answer ready. Melanie barely made it through the rest of the night. As the last guest left and the house fell silent, she found Noah waiting for her in the study, sprawled in Richard's leather chair, the picture of smug defiance. I'm done, Melanie said, her voice trembling. I won't pay you another cent. Do whatever you want, but this ends now. Noah's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. He stood, his voice rising. You think you can just walk away from this? I'll destroy you, Melanie. I'll tell Richard everything, about the affair, the money, all of it. Go ahead, she shot back, surprising even herself with her sudden boldness. Do it. But I'm not living like this anymore. Noah stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Melanie collapsed into the chair, her body shaking. For the first time in months, she had stood up to him. But the small victory felt hollow. Deep down, she knew that Noah wasn't finished. As the clock struck midnight, the snow began to fall once more, blanketing Maplewood in an eerie stillness. The storm that had been brewing in the Ramsey household was about to reach its devastating climax. The morning of Christmas Day arrived in Maplewood, blanketed in fresh snow that glittered under the pale winter sun. The Ramsey house, once alive with the cheer of the previous evening's festivities, now stood in oppressive silence. Melanie lingered in the kitchen, absently stirring her coffee, her mind replaying her confrontation with Noah from the night before. His threats had been explicit, his anger palpable. She knew he wouldn't back down. Upstairs, Noah nursed the sting of humiliation. Melanie's defiance had been unexpected, and it burned in his chest like an open wound. For months, he had wielded control over her, relishing every moment of her desperation. But now, she had dared to stand against him, and Noah was determined to reclaim his power. The house was cloaked in darkness by the time Noah returned home after an evening spent brooding at a local bar. He climbed the stairs quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Reaching his bedroom, he shut the door and sank onto his bed, formulating his next move. Tomorrow, he decided, he would tell Richard everything. Let Melanie squirm under the weight of her exposed lies. But Noah wasn't the only one making plans that night. In the shadows outside the house, Ethan Kingsley stood waiting. His breath formed faint clouds in the freezing air as he stared up at the second-floor windows. Melanie's plea for help echoed in his mind. She had begged him to protect her, to make this nightmare end. Ethan had promised her he would handle it, and he intended to keep that promise. The sound of breaking glass startled Noah out of his thoughts. He turned toward the window, his brow furrowing. Then came the creak of the door opening, slow and deliberate. His heart rate quickened as a shadow filled the doorway. "Ethan?" Noah sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ethan stepped into the room, his silhouette looming. "We need to talk." Noah stood, his defiance unwavering despite the unease creeping up his spine. "You've got some nerve showing up here." "What, you think you're going to scare me again?" "This isn't about scaring you," Ethan said, his tone icy. "It's about ending this." The tension in the room was electric, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Noah moved toward Ethan, his posture aggressive. "You don't get to decide how this ends. You don't control me." Ethan's patience snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Noah by the collar. The younger man struggled, his fists flying, but Ethan's strength and precision quickly overwhelmed him. The fight was brutal, their grunts and the sound of shattering furniture muffled by the house's thick walls. It was over in minutes. Noah collapsed onto the floor, his body still and lifeless, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Ethan stood over him, his chest heaving, blood splattered on his shirt. The room fell eerily silent. Downstairs, Melanie clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white. She had heard the muffled thuds, the sounds of a struggle. Fear kept her rooted in place, her heart pounding in her chest. When the noises ceased, she forced herself to move. Ascending the stairs with trembling legs, she reached Noah's room and pushed the door open. The sight before her stole her breath. Ethan turned to face her, his expression grim, his hands stained with blood. Behind him, Noah's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor. "He's dead," Melanie whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. It had to be done. Melanie's knees buckled, and she leaned against the doorway for support. What do we do now?" Ethan stepped toward her, his voice calm and deliberate. "We clean this up. No one will ever know." Ethan took control with a cold efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. Together, they worked in silence, wiping down every surface, removing any trace of the struggle. The stained carpet was cut away and bundled into a garbage bag. Noah's body was wrapped in a tarp from the garage. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan loaded Noah's body into the trunk of his car. "I'll handle the rest," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Melanie stood in the driveway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Where will you take him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's a quarry about 2 hours from here," Ethan replied. "It's deep, remote. No one will find him." Melanie nodded, unable to speak. She watched as Ethan's car disappeared down the street, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. When Richard returned home later that day, Melanie greeted him with a strained smile. "Noah left early this morning," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "He said something about visiting friends for a few days." Richard accepted the explanation without question, though he seemed distracted. Melanie went through the motions of the day, cooking, cleaning, and chatting with Richard as if nothing was amiss. But her mind was elsewhere, consumed by what had transpired. Ethan, true to his word, disposed of Noah's body in an abandoned quarry. He returned to Maplewood that evening, his demeanor unchanged, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. For a brief moment, Melanie allowed herself to believe that the worst was over. But the silence that followed Noah's disappearance was far from comforting. It was the calm before the storm, a fragile illusion that would soon shatter. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing Maplewood in a deceptive serenity, the truth lay buried, both in the quarry and within the walls of the Ramsey home. The nightmare, Melanie realized, was far from over. The stillness that followed Noah's disappearance hung heavy over the Ramsey household, a suffocating silence that neither Richard nor Melanie dared to break. For weeks, Melanie clung desperately to the fragile narrative she had spun, that Noah had left town to visit friends. She forged emails from his account, staged phone calls when Richard was within earshot, and fabricated stories about Noah's supposed adventures. But the weight of the lie pressed down on her with each passing day. As January 2024 began, Detective Stella Morrison of the Maplewood Police Department received an official missing persons report. The filing didn't come from Melanie, who had done everything in her power to avoid raising suspicion, but from one of Noah's co-workers at the garage. Concerned by Noah's sudden and unexplained absence, the co-worker had contacted the authorities. The investigation began quietly, but Detective Morrison had an uncanny instinct for cases that didn't add up. Something about Noah's disappearance struck her as wrong from the start. At first, the investigation moved slowly. Melanie's fabricated emails and vague explanations provided a thin veil of plausible deniability. But as weeks stretched into months, questions began to pile up. Why hadn't Noah accessed his bank account since Christmas? Why had he stopped returning calls from friends? And why did Melanie's answers to these questions seem rehearsed, almost mechanical? Detective Morrison began piecing together the Ramsey family's dynamics. Interviews with neighbors and acquaintances painted a picture of a household under strain. One neighbor mentioned hearing raised voices coming from the house on Christmas Eve. Another spoke of Noah's volatile relationship with his stepmother. Bit by bit, Morrison uncovered a web of tension and resentment that hinted at something far darker than a young man leaving town on a whim. By early April, the cracks in Melanie's carefully constructed story had grown too wide to ignore. Morrison, relentless and methodical, zeroed in on Melanie. A subpoena for Noah's phone records revealed a series of heated text exchanges with Melanie in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. It was clear that their relationship had been fraught with conflict, but one name in the record stood out: Ethan Kingsley. Melanie was summoned to the police station for questioning. Detective Morrison greeted her with professional courtesy, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. Over the course of hours, she walked Melanie through a series of seemingly innocuous questions, gradually tightening the noose. "Melanie," Morrison said, her tone calm but firm, "can you explain why you were in such frequent contact with Ethan Kingsley during December? The records show dozens of calls and messages." Melanie hesitated, her carefully maintained composure beginning to falter. "Ethan's a client," she said quickly. "We were working on a project together. That's all." Morrison nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. "And these messages," she continued, sliding a transcript across the table. "They don't seem work-related. In fact, they seem quite personal." Melanie's breath hitched as she scanned the text exchanges. She had thought she'd deleted everything incriminating. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered. I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Morrison said, leaning forward. "But here's the thing. We've also spoken to some of Noah's co-workers. One of them overheard a heated argument between you and Noah just before Christmas. He mentioned money. Threats." The word struck Melanie like a physical blow. Her carefully rehearsed story unraveled as panic set in. She opened her mouth to protest, but Morrison held up a hand. "Let me be clear, Melanie," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to find out what happened to Noah. It's only a matter of time. The question is, do you want to tell your side of the story now, or do you want us to piece it together without you?" For a moment, the room was silent. Then, as if a dam had broken, Melanie began to cry. Between sobs, the truth spilled out, about Noah's discovery of her affair, his blackmail, and the escalating threats. She recounted her desperate plea to Ethan for help, her inability to stop him when he took matters into his own hands, and the horrifying moment she found Noah's lifeless body on the floor of his bedroom. "He said he'd take care of it," Melanie whispered, her voice hollow. "I didn't know. I didn't know he'd go that far." With Melanie's confession, the case broke wide open. An APB was issued for Ethan Kingsley, who had vanished shortly after Christmas. Detective Morrison, working with state and federal authorities, tracked Ethan's movements to a series of motels along the East Coast. It was in Hartford Union Station that he was finally apprehended, attempting to board a train bound for Canada. Under intense interrogation, Ethan initially denied everything. But as evidence mounted, Melanie's testimony, the quarry where Noah's body was found, and forensic traces in Ethan's car, he cracked. He admitted to killing Noah, though he tried to frame it as an act of self-defense, painting himself as a man pushed to the brink by a reckless and violent young man. The truth shattered what little remained of the Ramsey family's facade. Richard, blindsided by the revelations of Melanie's affair and Noah's death, withdrew from public life, selling the family home and leaving Maplewood behind. Melanie, despite her attempts to position herself as a victim, was charged with conspiracy and accessory to murder. Ethan, with his cold and calculated actions, faced charges of first-degree murder. As the story unfolded in the media, the once idyllic town of Maplewood found itself at the center of a scandal that rocked its foundations. The tragedy of Noah's death, the duplicity of Melanie, and the ruthlessness of Ethan left an indelible mark on the community. For Detective Morrison, the case was bittersweet. She had untangled the web of lies and brought the perpetrators to justice, but the weight of what had been lost lingered. In her quiet moments, she couldn't help but wonder, could it all have been prevented? In the end, the truth was laid bare, but the cost was immeasurable. The Ramsey family, once a symbol of success, was now a cautionary tale of deception, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets left unchecked. The Ramsey family, once a symbol of prosperity and perfection in Maplewood, had crumbled into a cautionary tale of betrayal and tragedy. By late April 2024, the media frenzy surrounding Noah Ramsey's disappearance and the subsequent revelations had turned the quiet suburban town into a spectacle. Reporters lined Maple Street, cameras capturing the once pristine facade of the Ramsey home, now a grim reminder of the chaos that had unfolded within its walls. Melanie sat motionless in the courtroom as the judge delivered her sentence, 25 years in prison for conspiracy and being an accessory to murder, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Her defense team had painted her as a victim, trapped in a situation spiraling out of her control. But the jury wasn't swayed. They saw a woman who had made choices, dangerous, selfish choices, that led to her stepson's death. As she was led away, Melanie didn't look at the gallery where Richard sat, his face pale and expressionless. She knew there was no forgiveness waiting for her there. Ethan Kingsley, the man who had once charmed his way into Melanie's life with his charisma and sophistication, faced a harsher fate. The evidence against him was overwhelming, from Melanie's confession to the forensic traces tying him to Noah's death. The court showed no mercy, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, Ethan attempted to justify his actions, claiming he had only wanted to protect Melanie and eliminate a threat to their future. But his words rang hollow in the shadow of his cold and calculated actions. For the jury, there was no doubt, Ethan was a killer. Richard Ramsey, the once proud patriarch, retreated from the public eye. Unable to bear the weight of his son's death and his wife's betrayal, he sold the family home and moved to a quiet town in Vermont. Those who knew him described a man broken beyond repair, haunted by the loss of the two people he had trusted most. He rarely spoke of Maplewood or the events that had shattered his life, preferring the solitude of his small lakeside cabin to the prying eyes of the world. The town of Maplewood, known for its low crime rates and family-friendly charm, struggled to recover from the scandal. The Ramsey family's downfall forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. Behind closed doors, how many other families were hiding secrets? How many others were living under the weight of lies? For Detective Stella Morrison, the case was both a triumph and a burden. She had brought justice to Noah, unraveling a web of deceit that might otherwise have remained hidden. But the cost weighed heavily on her. Could she have acted faster? Was there a moment when Noah's life could have been saved? Those questions lingered long after the case was closed. The tragedy of the Ramsey family became a dark legend in Maplewood, a reminder of how secrets, left unchecked, could fester into something deadly. Noah Ramsey's death wasn't just the result of one violent night, it was the culmination of years of resentment, neglect, and betrayal. Melanie's desperation, Noah's anger, and Ethan's ruthlessness formed a lethal combination that tore a family apart. As spring blossomed in Maplewood, the town began to move forward, but the echoes of the Ramsey family's story lingered. The once idyllic home on Maple Street remained unsold, its windows dark and empty. And for those who remembered, the story served as a stark warning: even the most perfect facades can hide the darkest secrets. What do you think about the story of the Ramsey family? Was Melanie truly a victim of circumstance, or did her actions seal her fate? Could Noah's life have been saved if someone had intervened sooner? And what about Ethan? Was he a cold-blooded killer, or a man pushed too far by love and desperation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe justice was served, or do you see shades of gray in this tragic tale? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime content. We'd love to hear your opinions, theories, and reflections on this case.